They always say you find out who people really are during a crisis. I found out during a hurricane. My name is Elena Voss, and I was 17 years old the night my family made a decision that would quietly change everything, not just for me, but for every single one of them. They just didn't know it yet. The storm had been the only topic on television for 2 days straight. Category 4. Mandatory evacuation. The kind of warning where meteorologists stop smiling and start using words like catastrophic and unsurvivable surge. Neighbors were taping windows, loading cars, calling elderly relatives. The gas stations had lines stretching 2 blocks. Everyone understood the assignment. Everyone except my family. I had already packed. My sneakers were by the door. I had food and water portioned into bags for our 2 dogs and the old gray cat who had slept under my bed since I was 12. I assumed we were leaving like every other family on our street. I assumed wrong. My mother stood in the kitchen looking at the animals, then at the bags, then at the cars outside filling with people who actually intended to survive. And she said it so casually, the way you'd ask someone to grab milk on the way home, that for a second I thought I had misheard her. Someone needed to stay behind. Hotels didn't take pets. And an empty house near the coast was basically an open invitation for looters after a storm. I laughed. An actual, genuine laugh because I was 17 and still believed that some things were too absurd to be serious. Nobody laughed with me. What happened next is something I have replayed in my mind for nearly a decade. My father walked past me with a sheet of plywood and went straight to my bedroom window. I followed him, confused, asking questions he didn't answer. He pressed the wood against the frame and started hammering it shut from the outside. Asked him why he was boarding my window when everyone else was being told to get in the car. He said it was so I wouldn't get any ideas once the wind picked up. That sentence. Those exact words. I have never forgotten them. Not the tone, not the way he didn't look at me when he said it, not the sound of the nails going in. My mother left in the first car. My younger brother settled into the back seat with his headphones already on. My aunt balanced a cooler of snacks on her lap, like she was heading to a picnic. My father flipped the main breaker on his way out, killed the power to the whole house, and then he was gone too. I stood on the porch as the taillights disappeared and the sky turned the color of a bruise. I was alone. The storm was coming, and the window to my room was nailed shut from the outside. Some people have a single moment that divides their life into before and after. That was mine. I want to tell you what 19 hours inside a Category 4 hurricane feels like when you are alone and 17 and the power has been cut and your bedroom window is nailed shut from the outside. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like the longest, quietest kind of terror, the kind that doesn't scream. It just sits next to you in the dark and breathes. The first few hours weren't the worst. The wind was loud, but manageable. I moved the animals into the hallway. The dogs pressing against my legs, the cat clawing up into my arms like she understood something I was still pretending not to. I jammed wet towels under the doors the way I had seen someone do it once on a storm preparation video. I kept my phone pressed to my chest, watching the battery percentage the way you watch a clock when you're waiting for something that might not come. My phone died 6 hours in. After that, the storm stopped being background noise and became something else entirely. I heard the roof take its first hit somewhere around hour 8. Not a creak, a slam. Like something enormous had been dropped on the house from above. The walls flexed. The hallway light fixture, which I had turned off to save power before I realized there was no power, swung slightly even though there was no reason for it to move. I pulled both dogs closer. The cat had burrowed so deep into my hoodie, she had drawn blood on my shoulder without either of us noticing. I thought about the nailed window. I thought about it more than I thought about the storm. If something caught fire, if the ceiling gave way, if water started coming in from somewhere I couldn't reach, the window was the exit I no longer had. And that is when something shifted inside me. Not fear. I was already past fear. Something colder and more permanent. A kind of clarity you don't ask for. For the first time in my life, I stopped wondering why my family treated me differently. I stopped replaying every birthday they half remembered, every achievement they barely acknowledged, every time my younger brother received something I had been told we couldn't afford. I stopped trying to find the charitable explanation, the stress excuse, the benefit of the doubt. I finally just let myself know what I already knew. I smiled in that dark hallway, and I want to be honest with you about that, because it sounds strange. I was not okay. I was not brave. I was a teenager sitting on a floor with wet towels under the door and a cat bleeding into my shoulder, while something heavy and unknown destroyed the roof above me. I smiled because sometimes the truth, even a terrible truth, is a relief after years of pretending you don't see it. They came back 19 hours later, irritated about traffic. My mother walked past me to check if the dogs had scratched the floors. My father checked the window frames before he checked my face. My brother complained the hotel breakfast had been disappointing. I told them I had thought I was going to die. My mother sighed like I had embarrassed her in public. "Mara, stop being dramatic. The house is fine." My father said I was old enough to handle it, and something in me went very, very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that heals, the kind that decides. There is a particular skill that children raised in the wrong kind of home develop without anyone teaching them. It is the skill of becoming invisible while still physically occupying space. Of learning to read a room so accurately that you can predict the mood, adjust your behavior, and slip through the day without triggering anything. By the time I was 18, I had mastered it completely. I stopped telling my mother when something hurt. I stopped asking my father for anything, rides, advice, signatures on school forms. I stopped reacting when my brother made jokes about me being the family ghost, which he thought was funny and which was, accidentally, the most honest thing he ever said about me. I learned that silence could function as armor if you wore it long enough and consistently enough that people stopped trying to find the seams. The adults around me mistook this for maturity. Teachers called me focused. A guidance counselor told me I had an unusually strong sense of direction for someone my age. What none of them understood was that direction was just another word for escape. I was not building a future. I was engineering an exit. Every scholarship application I filled out in secret felt like a door opening in a room I had thought was sealed. Every college website I visited after midnight, careful to clear the history, careful to keep my voice neutral at dinner, careful to give nothing away, felt like oxygen reaching somewhere that had been slowly suffocating. But before I get to the escape, you need to understand the full weight of what I was escaping from. Because the hurricane was the loudest moment, but it was never the only one. My father, Daniel Voss, had worked in county infrastructure management for nearly 2 decades. He understood storm systems, evacuation protocols, structural risk. He was not a man who acted out of ignorance the night he nailed my window shut. He was a man who understood exactly what a Category 4 storm could do to a roof, a wall, a teenage girl trapped in the dark, and he made his choice anyway. My mother, Patricia Voss, ran the front office of a well-regarded elementary school and served on the hospitality committee at our church. Neighbors described her as warm, devoted, endlessly patient. She had a particular talent for making other people's children feel seen and safe. I used to wonder if I was the only child that gift had never reached. I eventually stopped wondering and accepted the answer. My brother, Marcus, was 2 years younger than me and had occupied a different universe within the same house for as long as I could remember. When he brought home a B in any subject, my mother taped the paper to the refrigerator and said he was working so hard. When I brought home straight A's, my father looked up from his coffee just long enough to say that was what was expected. Marcus got new shoes at the start of each school year. I got his old backpack when he decided the zipper was inconvenient. He received a used truck on his 16th birthday because my father explained a boy needed independence. I walked 3 miles home from school because the same man explained walking built character. And then there was my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, who had moved into our house when I was 14 following what the family generously described as a rough patch. The rough patch extended for years. She contributed nothing financially and had strong opinions about how selfish I was. She called Marcus sweetheart. She called me difficult. She once told my mother I had a face that looked like I was always accusing someone, as though the problem was my expression rather than the things I had accumulated reasons to feel. The only person in my life who made me feel like I was supposed to exist was my grandmother, Nana Ruth. She lived 15 minutes away in a pale blue house with white trim and a porch swing that creaked every time the coastal wind moved through it. She attended every single school performance I was ever in, including the ones where I had one line. She taught me to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, patient and calm, never once making me feel incompetent. She kept my favorite snacks in her pantry because she had noticed, quietly, without ever making it a speech, that my mother only bought what Marcus liked. When I was younger, I thought Nana Ruth was simply an unusually loving person. When I got older, I understood she was deliberately filling a space my parents had chosen to leave empty. She never said they were cruel. She was too careful and too wise for direct accusations. But when I was 15, she watched my mother forget my birthday dinner because Marcus had a baseball game that evening. And Nana looked at me across her kitchen table and said something I have carried every day since. Baby, never spend your energy begging people to see you when they have spent years training themselves to look away. I did not yet understand how much I would need that sentence. But it was already taking root in me, quiet and steady, like something preparing to hold weight. Because what happened the night of the hurricane was not a sudden rupture in an otherwise functional family. It was the most honest moment in 17 years of carefully maintained pretense. They had always chosen themselves over me. The storm simply gave them a situation where the choice was impossible to disguise. And I had finally, irrevocably, seen it. I left for college on a Tuesday morning in late August, and nobody in my family, except Nana Ruth, knew I was going. That is not an exaggeration. I had applied to 11 schools. I had been accepted to 7. I had accepted a full scholarship to a university 4 hours inland, close enough for Nana Ruth to visit on a long weekend, far enough that no one could ask me to come home for dinner. I had completed the housing forms, the orientation registration, the financial paperwork. I had done all of it quietly, methodically, the same way I had survived every year under that roof, by giving away nothing until the moment arrival was already irreversible. My mother stood in the kitchen looking at her phone the morning I left. She glanced up long enough to ask if I was sure I wasn't making a scene. My father, sitting at the table, wanted to know when I'd be back to help clean out the garage. My brother told me not to come home acting fancy, just because I had a scholarship. Aunt Diane offered that college girls always returned with attitudes, as if that were a warning rather than an observation about what happens when young women are finally allowed to think for themselves. Nana Ruth was already in the driveway with the engine running. There was a box of sandwiches on the passenger seat. I looked back at that house before I got in the car, not with sadness, not with longing, not with the complicated grief that people expect when you leave the place where you grew up. I looked at it the way you look at a costume that never fit. Something you wore for years because you had no other option, and you can finally, mercifully, return it. College did not fix me overnight. I want to be honest about that because I have no interest in offering a false version of this story. Freedom is not a cure. The first time my roommate asked where my family was during Parents' Weekend, I smiled and said they were busy. The first time a thunderstorm knocked out power in my dormitory, I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes before I could convince myself to stand up. Some things live in the body long after the mind has moved on. But slowly, steadily, I built a life that did not require their approval or their participation. I chose my field deliberately. I studied disaster planning, insurance compliance, and coastal property risk assessment. People occasionally asked why someone my age was so interested in evacuation protocols, hurricane codes, and the legal obligations of property owners during emergencies. I told them storms had always fascinated me. It was easier than explaining the real answer. I wanted to understand every system that had failed me. I wanted to know what people were legally required to do, what they were morally required to do, and precisely what happened when they chose to ignore both. I worked part-time in the campus housing office. I interned with a coastal insurance firm the summer after my second year. I spent 2 more summers reviewing storm damage reports for properties along the barrier islands, learning how houses failed, how insurance claims were manipulated, how evacuation plans were written and rewritten, and often abandoned. Every skill I added became another layer of insulation between myself and the version of my life I had left behind. My parents called occasionally. When they did, it was never simply to ask how I was. It was because they needed something, A form explained, a letter from the county interpreted, once a request to send my brother money because he had gotten himself into trouble with a car payment. I said no, consistently, calmly, and without lengthy explanation. Nana Ruth called every Sunday evening without exception. She asked about my classes, my friends, what I was reading, whether I had laughed that week. She visited twice a year with homemade pecan bars in a tin that smelled like her kitchen. And during one of those visits, when I was 22 and living in a small apartment near campus, she sat across from me on my secondhand couch and told me something that rearranged everything I thought I understood. The house, the pale blue coastal house where I had grown up, where I had been left behind during the storm, where my family had lived for as long as I could remember, was not my parents' house. It had always been hers. My parents had moved in when I was small, telling her they needed temporary help getting on their feet. Temporary became permanent, became assumed. They paid reduced rent sporadically, and then almost nothing at all. They treated the property like an inheritance they had already collected in advance. When the taxes fell behind, Nana Ruth paid them. When repairs were needed and ignored, Nana Ruth covered them. She had kept giving, she told me quietly, because she believed that if she provided enough stability, they might eventually become the parents I deserved. Her voice went very small when she said that. I was wrong about them, Elena. I kept hoping love would make your mother kinder. It didn't. Then she took my hand and told me she had changed her will. The house would come to me. I told her not to do it, not because I didn't want it, but because I already knew, with absolute precision, what would follow. My mother would say I had manipulated an elderly woman. My father would say I had stolen from the family. My brother would invoke fairness, as though fairness had ever been a principle anyone in that house had applied to me. And Aunt Diane would call me greedy from a bedroom she had never paid a single month's rent to occupy. Nana Ruth listened to every word of my objection. Then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. That house protected people who never once protected you. When I'm gone, I wanted to protect you instead. 3 years later, she passed away peacefully in her sleep, on an ordinary morning, after making coffee and feeding the birds on her porch. When I heard that detail, something in my chest cracked open, not from grief alone, but from recognition. She had left the world exactly the way she had moved through it, quietly, taking care of something smaller than herself, asking nothing in return. I flew home for the funeral. I kept my distance from my family. My mother cried loudly and accepted comfort from neighbors who had no idea what had happened inside that house. My father stood beside her playing the role of grieving son-in-law with practiced solemnity. My brother wore a dark suit and looked bored until someone mentioned the property. Aunt Diane whispered too loudly that Nana had always had a strange attachment to me, as if love were something suspicious when it was given to the wrong person. The will was read 2 weeks later. I was not in the room when they heard it. I didn't need to be. I already knew what was coming, and I had been preparing for it far longer than any of them realized. The call started within 10 minutes of the will being read. My mother called 11 times before leaving a voicemail that began with confusion so theatrical it almost deserved applause, and ended with a rage so raw it confirmed she had never genuinely expected to be held accountable for anything in her life. My father sent 2 words in a text, "Call me now." My brother composed a long, carefully worded message about how Nana Ruth would never have wanted to divide the family, as though the family had not been divided since the day I was born, along a fault line running directly through me. Aunt Diane told anyone who would listen that I had poisoned an elderly woman against her own blood. I read every message. Then I placed my phone face down on my desk and went back to work. That was the first time I fully understood what it meant to hold power quietly. For my entire childhood, they had controlled every room, every rule, every version of every story. They had decided what was dramatic and what was reasonable, who deserved comfort and who needed to toughen up, whose feelings counted and whose were inconvenient. And now a single document, signed in Nana Ruth's careful, unhurried handwriting, had quietly, permanently, changed the architecture of everything. I could have moved immediately to evict them.
Part of me wanted to.
But I had spent years studying how systems worked, and I understood that a rushed, emotional decision would hand them exactly the narrative they were already constructing. They would cry to the neighborhood that I had thrown grieving parents into the street days after a funeral. They would be believed. They always had been. So instead, I did what my training had prepared me to do. I used structure. I used documentation. I used language precise enough that twisting it would require them to expose themselves in the process. I had a formal lease agreement drafted at current market rate for the coastal area, which had appreciated significantly due to the explosion of short-term rental demand along that stretch of the Outer Banks. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Rent due on the 1st of each month, late fees beginning on the 5th, all maintenance requests submitted in writing, no long-term guests without prior written approval from the owner. Only my parents were listed as approved tenants. Aunt Diane was not listed. My brother was not listed. No exceptions, no grace period for arrangements that had never been authorized. My mother called it humiliating. My father called it a betrayal. My brother said requiring your own parents to sign a lease was something he didn't have words for, which I noted was somewhat ironic given how many words he had found when the inheritance was announced. Aunt Diane said Nana Ruth would be ashamed of me, which told me everything I needed to know about how well Aunt Diane had actually known her. I gave them 30 days to sign or vacate. They signed on day 28. I still remember the moment the countersigned copy arrived. I sat with it for a long time, not with triumph, not with satisfaction exactly, but with something quieter and more complicated. Grant and Patricia Voss. Signatures on a document that established, in legally binding terms, that they were tenants in a house they had treated as their birthright. The same two people who had once nailed a teenager's window shut and cut the power and driven away into a storm now required my written permission to continue sleeping under that roof. For 3 years, I kept everything professional. I did not visit for holidays. I did not respond to emotional texts. I did not engage with guilt, accusations, or the ongoing attempts to rewrite history that arrived in my inbox with depressing regularity. My mother wanted phone calls where she could cry and contradict herself and revise the past in real time. I gave her email threads with timestamps. My father wanted to intimidate with silence and terse commands. I gave him scanned documents and read receipts. What they had not anticipated, what they had perhaps never once considered, was that the quiet girl they had raised to make herself small had spent a decade becoming someone who kept meticulous records. Then, in the 3rd year, the payments started arriving late. First by 3 days, then by 2 weeks. Then 1 month simply did not come at all. And around the same time, not coincidentally, I was certain, my brother suddenly became friendly. He texted to ask how I was doing. He sent a photo of his new business card from a real estate office and suggested we catch up as adults, as though we had ever been close enough to return to something. I knew immediately that something was moving behind the conversation. My brother's warmth lasted exactly 4 exchanges before the real purpose emerged. Our father's health had been difficult, he said. Our mother was under tremendous stress. The house was becoming too much for them, but relocating at their age would be devastating. He had been thinking professionally, as someone now working in real estate, that perhaps there was a solution that could work for everyone. Whenever anyone in my family used the word everyone, they meant themselves. He told me they had assembled approximately $55,000. They had emptied savings, borrowed from friends at their church, sold my father's fishing boat, and pressured my brother himself to contribute. They wanted to use it as a down payment to purchase the house from me at what he called a family price. The property, by that point, was worth several times that amount. The land value alone had risen dramatically. I asked my brother what he believed a family price meant. He said it meant not treating the people who raised you like strangers. I almost laughed. Raised was such a generous word for what they had done. People raised children by protecting them, by choosing their safety, by making them feel that their existence is something the family is glad for. My parents had stored me in that house the way you store furniture you don't particularly like, but haven't decided what to do with yet. I drove back to the coast 6 days later with a folder on the passenger seat and no emotional space left for nostalgia. The house looked worse than I expected. Nana Ruth's blue paint had faded to a tired, weathered gray. One section of porch railing leaned outward at an angle that suggested years of neglect. The storm shutters were rusted at the hinges. The flower beds she had tended with such quiet devotion had become tangles of weeds and cracked stone edging. They had lived in a house they claimed to treasure and treated it exactly the way they had treated me, useful until it required genuine care, at which point it became someone else's problem. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She smiled too brightly and said I looked thin. My father sat in the living room recliner, older than I remembered, jaw set in the expression he had always used when he wanted everyone around him to feel the weight of his disappointment. My brother's truck was parked 2 houses down the street. I noticed it before I even reached the porch. They had rehearsed. My mother spoke about legacy, about family continuity, about what Nana Ruth would have wanted. My father said $55,000 represented a genuine sacrifice, and that a daughter, who had done well for herself, had no reason to squeeze the people who had given her everything. I let him finish. I let every word land without interrupting, without reacting, without giving any indication of what I was holding in the folder on my lap. Then I asked him if he remembered what he had said to me when he nailed my bedroom window shut the night of Hurricane Isabella. The room changed. My mother's face tightened into something brittle. My father looked at the hallway wall, not at me. He said we were not doing this again. I said we were. My mother snapped that I had been holding on to that storm for too long. That I was alive, that the house was still standing, that normal daughters did not punish their families indefinitely over one difficult night. That was when I opened the folder. I was not selling the house. Not for $55,000. Not for any amount they could offer. I had accepted a purchase offer from a coastal retreat company that planned to fully restore the property, storm-rated windows, emergency lighting, pet-friendly evacuation resources, licensed short-term rental operation. Legal, permitted, and financially sound in every respect. They had 60 days to vacate under the existing lease terms. My mother's tears arrived fast. I recognized them. I had been watching those tears perform their work on rooms full of people my entire life. They were not grief. They were a strategy. She asked how I could do this to my own parents. My father said Nana Ruth would be disgusted by the person I had become. I told him Nana Ruth had known exactly what she was doing when she signed that will. And then my brother walked in through the front door wearing the careful, measured expression he used when he wanted to present himself as the reasonable one, the peacemaker, the adult in the room, and I understood immediately that he had been parked down the street the entire time, waiting for his cue. Before anyone could speak again, I heard movement on the staircase. Aunt Diane came down in slippers and a bathrobe, holding a coffee mug, hair wrapped in a towel. She froze when she saw me standing there with my phone already in my hand. According to the lease she had never been permitted to sign, she had not lived in this house for 3 years. I pressed record. My mother said, "Don't you dare." I said, "You lived in my property, violated my lease, lied to my face, and still assumed I came here unprepared." Aunt Diane called me a vindictive child. My brother told me I was escalating unnecessarily. My father said if I proceeded with this, I would never be welcome in the family again. I looked at the 4 of them standing in Nana Ruth's living room and felt something settle in my chest like a foundation being poured. I had not felt welcome in that family since long before the storm. I was not losing a place. I was finally, after 26 years, reclaiming one. 10 minutes after I left, my hands started shaking in a hardware store parking lot 3 blocks away. Not from regret. From adrenaline, the particular kind that floods your system after you have done something that cannot be undone, something that has been building for so long that the release of it almost feels physical. People imagine that moments like that one feel hot and righteous, like anger finally given a voice. Mine felt cold, precise, almost clinical. I sat in that parking lot until my breathing slowed and my hands steadied, and then a message arrived from a name I hadn't expected. Jonah Bell, Nana Ruth's neighbor of 30 years, a quiet man who still sent me a Christmas card every December with a lighthouse on the front. His message said he had heard I was in town and that there were things I needed to know before the upcoming community permit meeting. I called him immediately. What he told me explained something I had been sensing for years without being able to name, The slightly too long pauses when I was recognized in town, the way certain conversations stopped when I approached, the careful neutrality on faces that had once been simply warm. My parents had not merely complained about the lease arrangement to their friends. They had constructed an entire alternative narrative and distributed it throughout the community with the same quiet diligence that my mother brought to everything she wanted people to believe. According to the version circulating through the neighborhood, I had threatened to report my parents for crimes they hadn't committed unless they paid me. I had manipulated Nana Ruth during a period of cognitive decline. I was unstable, financially predatory, and obsessed with punishing my family for ordinary parental mistakes. After I accepted the Coastal Retreat Company's offer, the story evolved again. Now I was colluding with an outside company to commit insurance fraud, and the neighborhood had a responsibility to stop me. My mother had gone door to door with red eyes and a church voice. My father had hinted to contacts on the community permit board that there might be reasons to look more carefully at the application. My brother had been using his new real estate credentials to probe the buyer's background. Aunt Diane had apparently told half the street that I had left home because I was too selfish and too damaged to be part of a normal family. For a moment, sitting in that parking lot, I almost admired the coordination. They had never protected me with that much energy. They had never organized on my behalf with that much consistency and creativity. But let someone threaten their comfort, and suddenly the whole family moved like a single organism. I hired an attorney the next morning. Her name was Claire Maddox, and she was direct, methodical, and completely unmoved by emotional chaos, which made me trust her within the first 5 minutes of our meeting. I brought everything: the lease, the payment records, the video of Aunt Diane descending the staircase in her bathrobe on a Tuesday morning 3 years after she was supposed to have vacated. I brought the screenshots of my brother's messages, the accepted purchase offer, and the texts my father had sent after my visit, including one that read, "You think paperwork makes you powerful, but permits can get complicated when the right people start asking questions." And another, "I still know how this county works." Claire read that second one twice. Then she looked up and said simply, "Good. He put it in writing." She explained that the unauthorized occupant alone was sufficient to accelerate the lease termination well beyond the standard 60-day window. The documented attempts to interfere with the sale and the permit process introduced additional legal exposure they had not anticipated when they started making phone calls to board members. A formal 30-day notice went out citing lease violations, unauthorized occupancy, and deliberate interference with the owner's lawful business interests. My mother called 16 times the day it arrived. I did not answer once. She sent a text telling me I was heartless, that I was killing my father with stress, that Nana Ruth would never forgive me, that forgiveness was the defining quality of decent people. I replied once, and I chose my words with the same precision I had applied to every document in this process. Leaving a child alone in a Category 4 hurricane was not a mistake. It was a decision. Lying about that child for 9 years was also a decision. 30 days is more consideration than you gave me that night. My brother appeared at my apartment 2 days later without warning, at nearly 8 in the evening. I let him in because curiosity, as I have learned, is not the same as forgiveness, but it is occasionally useful. He sat on my couch and told me he understood why I was angry. That was the first lie. Then he said that what our parents had done during the storm was wrong, but that dismantling them now would not undo it. He said they needed accountability delivered through an apology process, not through public consequences. He said he was worried about what this was turning me into. He said I was becoming worse than them. That sentence was designed to wound. It did not. I told him there was a fundamental difference between what they had done and what I was doing. They had acted against a child who had no power, no resources, no recourse, and no voice that anyone in that house was willing to hear. I was acting against adults who had possessed 9 full years to tell the truth and had invested every one of those years in building a more elaborate lie. Those were not the same thing. They would never be the same thing. He left angry, which meant he had failed. The community permit meeting was held in a low brick building beside the public library, the kind of room where every chair squeaked and where the families who had lived in town the longest carried a quiet authority that newcomers spent years trying to earn.
My parents had counted on that.
They believed their decades of presence, their church memberships, their carefully maintained public reputations would function as a verdict delivered before I ever opened my mouth. The Coastal Retreat Company presented first. Their proposal was thorough, legally sound, and better for the property than anything my parents had done with it in years. Storm-rated windows, emergency lighting, pet evacuation protocols, clear guest safety documentation. Every permit was in order. Every inspection had been completed. Then public comment began. My mother stood in a soft cardigan and her most practiced expression of wounded maternal dignity. She told the room I had changed after leaving home, that I had become consumed by money and resentment, that I was forcing elderly parents out of a family home for profit, that she had reason to believe I was engaged in financial misconduct and that the board owed it to the neighborhood to investigate. My father sat beside her with his jaw tight. My brothers stared at the table. Aunt Diane nodded slowly, performing the role of corroborating witness. I waited until my mother finished every single word. Then I stood up, introduced myself as the legal property owner, and kept my voice level and even, because the truth does not need volume when it arrives with documentation. I presented the lease first. I explained that my parents were tenants, not owners, and had been tenants under a formal legal agreement for 3 years. I presented the occupancy clause and the video of Aunt Diane on the staircase, establishing that an unauthorized occupant had been living in the property throughout the lease period. I read my father's text message about permits becoming complicated when the right people asked questions, and one of the board members looked directly at him and asked if he had written it. My father said it had been taken out of context. I said I would be glad to provide the context. I pulled out the weather documentation from the night of Hurricane Isabella. Wind speeds, official warnings, mandatory evacuation orders, road closure records. And then I told the room, in plain and measured language, what had happened to me when I was 17 years old. That my family had evacuated. That I had been left behind to watch the house because hotels didn't accept pets. That my father had boarded my bedroom window from the outside before leaving. That he had cut the main power breaker. That I had spent 19 hours alone in a hallway closet with 2 dogs and a cat while the roof took damage above me. The room went so quiet I could hear someone's pen stop moving against their notepad. A board member asked my father if what I had described was accurate. He said the storm had not been as severe as I was making it sound. The board member asked whether he had left a minor child in the home during a declared mandatory evacuation. My father said I had been nearly 18. The board member asked whether he had boarded my window from the outside. He said it had been for my protection. I said, "Then why did you tell me it was so I wouldn't get any ideas once the wind picked up?" He did not answer. That silence did more damage than any speech I could have prepared. My mother began to cry, but this time the room did not lean toward her. It leaned away. My brother found something on the floor that required his complete attention. Aunt Diane's face had gone the color of old paper. The permit was approved. Unanimously. Afterward, Jonah Bell hugged me outside on the sidewalk and said Nana Ruth would have been proud. I held it together until I reached my car. And then I cried. Not for them, not from regret, but from something I had almost forgotten I was still capable of feeling. Relief. The specific, bone-deep relief of a truth that has been carried alone for a very long time finally being witnessed by a room full of people who could not unknow what they had heard. 6 days later, the 30-day deadline arrived. I came with my attorney and a sheriff's deputy because I had learned long ago never to enter that house unprepared. My mother stood in the driveway asking for 2 more weeks. She said the apartment they had found was too small. She said my father's health was fragile. She said I was throwing away family. I said 30 days was more than you gave me that night. My father walked out without looking at me. Aunt Diane loaded boxes into a borrowed van without speaking. My brother started to say something, and I told him there was nothing left that needed translating. The morning after the move out, my phone registered 53 missed calls by 9:30. My father texted, "Please stop. Don't do this." My mother wrote, "We were wrong. Please forgive us." Relatives who had not contacted me in years suddenly discovered my number and had opinions about how far I had taken things. I sent one message to the group. When I was 17, My parents left me alone in a Category 4 hurricane, boarded my window from the outside, cut the power, and came home calling me dramatic. None of you protected me then. Do not lecture me now because they have finally met consequences. Nobody replied. The sale closed several weeks later. My parents moved into a small apartment 40 minutes inland. My mother lost the neighborhood that had believed her version of events for nearly a decade. My father lost the quiet authority he had used to make people feel they owed him deference. My brother lost the role of reasonable mediator in a story where he had never actually been neutral. Aunt Diane lost the free room and her favorite occupation, judging me from inside a house she had never contributed a single dollar toward. I used a portion of the proceeds to establish a small fund in Nana Ruth's name. It helps animal shelters stock pet evacuation supplies and assists families with children in finding safe emergency lodging during hurricane warnings. Not as a gesture. Not as symbolism. Because the lesson I carried out of that hallway closet was never simply about what my family had done to me. It was about what it means to protect someone when protecting them costs you something. Children are not property guards. Pets are not justifications. And family is not determined by last names or shared blood or who cries the loudest in a room full of strangers. Family is determined by who stays. Some people will say I should have forgiven sooner or more completely, or without the structure of legal consequence attached to it.
I have thought about that.
I think forgiveness offered without accountability is simply permission for the next cruelty, handed over in the language of virtue. I do not wish them suffering. I do not need them to be broken. I only needed them to live, for once, inside the reality they had built, the way I had been living inside it since I was old enough to understand what was happening but too young to do anything about it. 9 years ago, I sat in a dark hallway during a hurricane and smiled because I had finally stopped pretending I didn't know the truth. I still smile now, but now it is because I am not trapped there anymore. And the house that Nana Ruth kept safe for all those years, the house that once sheltered people who never once sheltered me, is now doing what she always intended it to do. It is protecting someone who deserved it all along.